Thank you so much. I'm so grateful, for this lovely introduction. I felt very connected to your words, the energy, and I'm very honored to join you today and to give this speech at such a unique, great festival, but also in such a unique city with a strong memory, with an important history, and also with an amazing fabric of diversity. And I want to talk a little bit about these things. But maybe I have to make a confession first. Until recently, whenever I went to an international conference, I was very used to being one of the more gloomy speakers, one of the more depressed speakers. And I think there are many people in Turkey and outside of Turkey who feel quite depressed, quite demoralized, quite gloomy. But then there would be other speakers from other countries, and they would be equally gloomy, and they would come from places such as Egypt, Nigeria, Pakistan, Venezuela, the Philippines. We would listen to each other, we would smile at each other in sympathy, understanding. But there would remain an emotional gap between those of us who came from wobbly democracies or wounded democracies, and those of us who came from more stable democracies, who felt more cheerful. And then last year, things began to change, particularly in the year 2016, but also before. I realized there were more writers and poets among the team depressed. So there would be writers from Hungary joining us, writers from Poland, and then interestingly, writers from Austria, Holland, France, worried. And then, interestingly, writers from the UK, where I live and where I consider my home. And then came writers and poets from America. So suddenly there were more of us feeling worried about the fate of our nations, the fate of the world. And the interesting thing is, because we are more used to feeling depressed, and the newly depressed are not used to this feeling, they were relatively more depressed. So the previously depressed ones maybe felt a little bit more up in a feeling of global solidarity. But I want to talk about emotions a little bit. I want to talk about emotional intelligence. And I think we're living in an age in which emotions guide and misguide politics. And it is a pity that mainstream political theory does not put enough thought into emotions. I think we're living in an age in which there are lots of emotions on the surface, such as anxiety, apprehension, anger, fear, insecurity. And many of these emotions are understandable. If we don't let people, if we don't give them a chance to voice their emotions, I am worried that we will be pushing them towards the lap of the far right, towards the lap of the populist movements, where they feel it's okay to express their emotions. I am worried because I think populist demagogues, unfortunately, have made a better job at connecting with people's emotions than many liberals, many Democrats, many progressives. So we have to do a better job from now on, and we have to talk about emotions. And this is an interesting subject for us writers because we are emotional creatures. We always tap into emotions. So if you'll allow me, I want to start with emotions. And I want to take you back in time a little bit, not too far in time, but just a few decades. You will remember at the beginning of 2000s, there was so much optimism in the world, so much hope. We were convinced that thanks to globalization, we would all become deeply interconnected, thanks to a flow of ideas, circulation of human beings, circulation of capital, commodities, technology, finance. We would be so interconnected that nationalism would become redundant, religion would wither away, nation states would lose their power, supranational organizations would become more dominant, or non-governmental organizations. And in a way, there was an expectation among journalists, writers, academics, thinkers, that this was the triumph of the liberal or the neoliberal order. And there was a trust that history would move in one direction, and that direction would be progressive. So those countries who were lagging behind would sooner or later catch up with more democratic nations. After all, history was linear and progressive. And all those expectations, when I look at them, here's the paradox. Some of those expectations did come true, but the opposite also happened. Something else happened. Nationalism made a very strong comeback. Religiosity, religious fundamentalism made a strong comeback. And we ended up with a new ideology of tribalism. I call it tribalism. This teaching that tells us we all belong in our own tribes, and we will be safer if we're surrounded by sameness. This is what they're telling us. So all of a sudden we realized that globalization gave way to two contradictory energies, internationalism versus tribalism. And only 2 decades have passed since then, and today we are in a much more pessimistic mood in many parts of the world. So it is as if there's an emotional pendulum, and that emotional pendulum swings back and forth, and maybe the truth is somewhere in between. I am a nomad. Ever since my childhood, I've led a nomadic existence. I was born in Strasbourg, raised by my grandmother in Ankara. There was a time in Madrid, then Amman, Jordan, Cologne in Germany, Boston, Michigan, Arizona, back to Istanbul always. I love Istanbul. I consider myself an Istanbulite, and then London. I do believe that it is possible to have multiple belongings. I do believe that we do not have to be reduced to a single tribe, to a single monolithic identity. I think our main element is water. As human beings, we're made of water. 75% of our brains is water. It is much more closer to our nature to flow, to be more fluid, rather than to have solid, static identities. So as I travel east and west, I hear lots of people talking, questioning democracy. And I'm worried about that, because I think this is an age in which many people started to lose faith in democracy. And especially in countries like Turkey and across the Middle East, I hear people saying, you know what, maybe democracy is a Western thing. Maybe it doesn't suit our character, our traditions, our history. Maybe what we need is a strong leader with technocrats and bureaucrats. They're talking about illiberal democracies, and they're even talking about benevolent dictatorships, in different words. But that is an illusion. There is no such thing as a benevolent dictatorship, and there is no such thing as an undemocratic nation being stable. Undemocratic countries are essentially unhappy countries. And if a nation is unhappy, sooner or later it will become unstable. So I think it's incredibly important to renew people's faith in democracy, to start to talk about democracy. I, as a Turkish writer, I'm very used to talking about EU, Europe, democracy. I'm used to talking about these issues in Turkey. But to be honest, I never thought there would come a day when I would have to defend the EU in the UK, where I live. I thought that would never happen. But I was in the UK when Brexit happened, before the referendum, during the referendum, and I observed, and I listened, and I saw people becoming more emotional. And I never forget the day, one day, as I was in a car, this huge road sign close to London, and the sign said, the Turks are joining the EU, 80 million of them are coming, so it's time for us to leave. And I felt incredible sadness at seeing that. Sadness also because it was a lie. Sadness because everyone knew that Turkey was not joining the EU anytime soon, I'm sad to say. but also because the mobility of workers and many other issues can be regulated. These things can be controlled, but that wasn't the aim of the Leave campaign. What the Leave campaign was trying to do was to increase fear, apprehension, emotions, and it worked. And I'm sad because this kind of exclusivist, nationalistic, jingoistic language, let us not forget where this kind of language and ideologies took us, took the European continent not that long ago. But please don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that everyone who voted for Brexit is against Europe. I'm not saying that everyone who voted for Trump is against Muslims or anything like that. We have to make this distinction. We have to make a distinction between the political rhetoric and the people, and try to understand the worries, the anxieties of the people, and connect much better with them. But I have to tell you that it was interesting for me to see, for many of my friends in England, in France, the EU is mostly about a financial project. It's about economy, trade deals, benefits. Coming from Turkey, a country that was not able to join the EU, coming from there, to me, the EU is not primarily about economy or trade or finance. It is primarily about values. It's primarily about democracy, freedom of speech, women's rights. It's about minority rights. It's about LGBT rights. It's about the rights of the silenced. It's about rule of law, separation of powers. But in addition to all these values, for me, EU is primarily about memory. It's about remembering where tribalism could take us and to try to stay away from that path and to try to find values that we all share together, no matter what our ethnicity, nationality, race, gender, sex, or class. So it is that kind of bonding, supranational, umbrella, cement, humanism that matters to me enormously. So I guess what I'm trying to say is democracy turned out to be much more fragile than we thought. I think democracy is like an ecosystem that needs to be constantly nurtured and cared for. And Turkey, unfortunately, holds important lessons in that sense, because we in Turkey have seen how fast countries can go backwards. With a bewildering speed, democracy can melt. We in Turkey have seen that history does not necessarily always go forwards. Yes, sometimes it goes backwards. Yes, sometimes we draw circles and we make exactly the same mistakes that our ancestors have made. So if the world is changing, I think the literary world is also changing and should also change. And this is why I want to maybe invite, myself included, my fellow writers, perhaps to speak up louder and bolder about what's happening in the world today. Of course, Doris Lessing, very rightly so, and very beautifully, she described literature as analysis after the event. You know, things happen, then some time needs to pass, and then writers can process, digest, and then we can write. We need some time. But all I'm saying is, even though literature is analysis after the event, sometimes literature has to be analysis during the event. Sometimes writers need to respond. You know, there's an urgency, there's an immediacy. I come from a land where words are heavy. I think every Turkish writer, poet, journalist, academic knows by today that because of words we can get into trouble very easily. Anything you say in an interview, something you write in an article, even a tweet or a retweet can put you in trouble so quickly. In a day you can be slandered in pro-government papers. In a day you can be attacked by government trolls on social media, put on trial, sent into exile, and labeled as a traitor. And I think when we write, there's always this knowledge at the back of our minds. And as a result, there's a lot of self-censorship. And this is a very difficult subject to talk about. It's also a little bit embarrassing. How do you deal with the kind of censorship that comes from within? I'm not talking about a law that says you can't write about this subject. It's easier to point out at that law, but what happens when the pressure comes from inside? What happens when we internalize fear and intimidation and self-censorship? I think Turkey's literati, or the literary world, when you look at it, at the first glance, it looks very liberal, progressive, modern, but when you scratch the surface a little bit, underneath, I think it's equally patriarchal, just as sexist and homophobic as the rest of the culture. So there are things that we need to challenge within the literary world as well. And one of the things that hurts me is to see the lack of solidarity among the opposition, among people who are more Democrats, more progressives. There's so much bitterness, so much gossip, so much resentment, so much fragmentation. And when Democrats are divided like this, the only thing that benefits from it is the status quo. Just like when women are divided, fragmented, badly polarized, the only thing that benefits from this is patriarchy itself. So we have to find new ways of collaboration, new narratives, new forms of coexistence. Born in Budapest, the British Hungarian writer Arthur Koestler, I'm very interested in his writing, and he used to say that, because he dealt a lot with authoritarianism, and he used to say that authoritarianism does not only corrupt governments or politicians. He used to say, if power corrupts, be careful, the reverse is also true. Persecution corrupts the victim, though perhaps in a much more subtle and tragic way. He was very worried that writers in exile did not support each other, and he came from Hungary, he knew what he was talking about. I think for us writers, it's a little bit challenging to become activists, because at the end of the day, we are very solitary creatures. You know, we are introverts, we live in our own imaginary cocoons, so it's challenging to come into the public space. And yet at the same time, I believe these are the times we need to do this. George Orwell's writings are of interest to me as well. And he made a very important distinction. He said, when societies become more authoritarian or more closed, some forms of art may benefit from this or may find a way to survive. He thought poetry would survive. He thought architecture would even thrive under authoritarianism, so some forms of art might even thrive. But he said particularly novelists, particularly prose writers, their dilemma will be very big, because the choice they have to make is between speaking up and just erasing themselves through complete silence. And I think as prose writers coming from Turkey, we know what he's talking about. Overall, I think for a proper democracy to exist, we need more than the ballot box, and that is one of the biggest mistakes that the political elite in Turkey is making. They think if you have the ballot box and if you have the majority in the ballot box, that's enough and you can do whatever you want, it gives you legitimacy. It doesn't. The ballot box is only one of the requirements of democracy. In addition to that, you need rule of law, definitely separation of powers, definitely a free, diverse media, definitely independent academia, women's rights, and a robust civil society participating. Without any of these components, you will only end up with majoritarianism, and from majoritarianism to authoritarianism, it's a very, very short step. I think over the years we have seen in Turkey, across the Middle East, but particularly in my motherland, the increase in nationalism, yes, the increase in authoritarianism, the increase in Islamism, but also a strange increase in sexism. And I don't think this is a coincidence. When countries become more authoritarian, they become more militaristic or nationalistic. When they become more nationalistic, they become more sexist. When they become more sexist, they become more patriarchal, more homophobic, etc. So all of these processes, even though they might seem disconnected at first glance, in my opinion, they are deeply connected. Today, Turkey became the world's biggest jailer for journalists, surpassing even China's sad record. As we're speaking here today, there are people, there are journalists, so many people who have been stigmatized, slandered, blacklisted, imprisoned, arrested, released, detained again. There are thousands of academics who have lost their jobs, and when I say lost their jobs, please try to understand, these people have almost no chance of finding another job at another university in another part of Turkey. So their entire families are affected. And some of them, hundreds of them, have been sacked only because they signed a peace petition. How can it be a crime to sign a peace petition? I started my talk with emotions. I started my talk with a little bit of pessimism, and I want to quote exactly the same, paraphrase the same quote from Gramsci. How do we keep the hope alive? How do we get to a more optimistic point? And I think Gramsci really nailed it when he talked about the pessimism of the mind, because there's lots of reasons to be pessimistic. But at the same time, he talked about the optimism of the will. And I think if we focus on politics and politicians too much, yes, we will be gloomy. But when we talk to people, real people, women, students, minorities, people of all backgrounds, you will see there's so much strength there, there's so much energy there. And in Turkey, there's an amazing civil society. These people do exist. Maybe we don't hear their voices, but they are there. They are amazingly resilient, and we should always stay connected with them. Let us never, never isolate countries. Let us be critical of the governments and the politicians, but let us never isolate the countries. I think the only thing I want to say is let us also keep writing. We need stories. We need more storytellers. We need multiple stories, because the world might be messy as it is today, but a world that has lost its empathy, a world that has lost its cognitive flexibility to look at reality from different angles, a world that has lost its imagination will surely be a much darker place. Thank you so much. Thank you.